January 1st, 1945. Adolf Hitler stands in his East Prussian headquarters, staring at a map of Europe. His fingers trace the borders of his empire, from France to the gates of Moscow, from Norway to Greece. The 1,000-year Reich still controls millions of square miles and tens of millions of people. 129 days later, May 8, 1945, that empire no longer exists. Hitler is dead by his own hand in a bunker. Berlin is a smoking ruin. Every major German city is destroyed. Millions of soldiers are dead or in prison camps. The Nazi Party has ceased to exist. Germany itself has ceased to exist as a nation. Divided, occupied, utterly defeated. 129 days. That's all it took for one of history's most powerful military machines to completely disintegrate. Not gradually, not over years. In 4 months and 8 days, the Nazi regime went from controlling an empire to total annihilation. This is the story of history's most dramatic collapse, the final 129 days of Nazi Germany. And it's a story of how quickly everything can fall apart when the end finally comes. As 1945 began, Germany was already doomed. Everyone knew it, except perhaps the man in the bunker who refused to accept reality. The numbers told the story. The Soviets were 40 miles from Berlin, with over 6 million troops on the Eastern Front. The Americans and British had recovered from the Battle of the Bulge and were massing on Germany's western borders. Italian front collapsing, air superiority completely lost. German cities were being bombed around the clock, reducing them to rubble. But Hitler still talked about victory, about secret weapons that would turn the tide, about divisions that existed only on paper, about a German spirit that would prevail against impossible odds. Reality was about to deliver a devastating verdict. On January 12, 1945, the Soviet Union launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, the largest military offensive in human history. Over 2.2 million Soviet troops, 6,400 tanks, and 46,000 artillery pieces attacked along a 300-mile front. The German defenses, already weakened, undersupplied and demoralized, simply disintegrated. In 23 days, Soviet forces advanced 300 miles. 300 miles in 3 weeks. Entire German armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed or captured. By February 2nd, Soviet forces were on the Oder River, just 40 miles from Berlin. The unstoppable hammer was falling, and Germany was the anvil. But the human cost of this advance was staggering in ways that go beyond military casualties. As Soviet forces swept through East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, millions of German civilians fled westward in the dead of winter. Picture this. Temperatures dropping to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Roads clogged with refugees, mostly women, children, and elderly, because the men were dead or in the military. Horse-drawn carts piled with whatever possessions families could carry. People freezing to death by the roadside. Children separated from parents in the chaos, never to be reunited. Thousands died from exposure. Others were caught by advancing Soviet forces seeking revenge for Nazi atrocities in the Soviet Union. The stories from this period are among the war's darkest, stories most people don't know, but which haunted survivors for life. This was just the beginning of Germany's final agony. By February, Germany was being crushed from both sides like a vice. On February 13th of 15, the ancient city of Dresden, swollen with refugees, was firebombed by British and American aircraft. In 2 nights of raids, a firestorm consumed the city center, killing 25,000 to 35,000 people. Whether this was military necessity or a war crime remains debated to this day. But one thing was certain: there was no safe place left in Germany. The strategic bombing campaign had transformed Germany into a landscape of ruins. Hamburg destroyed. Cologne 80% gone. Berlin half destroyed. Hundreds of smaller cities reduced to rubble. Germany's industrial capacity was gutted. Transportation networks didn't exist anymore. Oil refineries were gone. The war economy had collapsed. German soldiers at the front often had no food, no ammunition, no fuel for their tanks. They were fighting with rifles while Allied forces had overwhelming superiority in everything. Tanks, planes, artillery, supplies, And then came March 7, 1945, a day that sent Hitler into a rage. American troops from the 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, intact. The bridge over the Rhine River, Germany's last natural defensive barrier, was supposed to be demolished. The demolition charges failed. Americans poured across before Germans could destroy it. Hitler was apoplectic. He ordered officers executed for the failure. But it didn't matter. Within weeks, Allied forces were crossing the Rhine at multiple points. British, Canadian, American, and French armies were racing into the heart of Germany. The Western Wall had fallen. Now there were no walls at all. April 1945 was the month Germany died. On April 16th, the Soviets launched their final offensive, the assault on Berlin. The numbers were staggering: 2.5 million troops, 6,250 tanks, 41,600 artillery pieces, 7,500 aircraft, all focused on one objective: the capital of the Reich. Standing in their way at the Seelow Heights, the last defensive position before Berlin, were exhausted German forces. Old men, teenage boys, and the remnants of once proud Wehrmacht units. The battle was a slaughter. The Germans fought desperately, but desperation doesn't stop 41,000 artillery pieces. In 3 days, the Soviets battered their way through, suffering 30,000 killed, but inflicting catastrophic losses on the defenders. Over 100,000 Germans were captured. The road to Berlin was open. On April 20th, Adolf Hitler turned 56 years old. His staff organized a birthday party in the Führer bunker, 30 feet underground. Above them, Soviet artillery shells were already landing in Berlin. Hitler emerged briefly to inspect Hitler Youth defenders, some as young as 12 years old, holding Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. He told them they would save Germany. He was sending children to die for a regime that was already dead. The Battle of Berlin began the next day. What followed was urban warfare at its most brutal. The Soviets, driven by revenge for Nazi atrocities in their homeland, fought block by block, building by building. German SS units executed their own soldiers for trying to surrender. Civilians huddled in cellars as their city was demolished around them. The Soviets suffered 80,000 killed and 280,000 wounded taking Berlin. German casualties were even worse. Military and civilian deaths combined reached into the hundreds of thousands. Meanwhile, on April 25th, American and Soviet troops met at the Elbe River at Torgau. They embraced. They drank together. They took photos that would become iconic. Germany was now cut in two. There was no escape, no way out, no miracle coming. By April 30th, the Führer bunker was shaking constantly from Soviet artillery strikes. The Red Army was within blocks. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich had about 8 days left. In his underground tomb, Hitler had married his longtime mistress Eva Braun the day before. He dictated his political testament, a rambling document that blamed everyone but himself for Germany's defeat. Jews, generals, the German people themselves for being too weak. Everyone but the man who started the war and led his nation to ruin. On the afternoon of April 30th, Hitler learned that his ally Mussolini had been captured by Italian partisans, executed and hung upside down in Milan for crowds to mock. Hitler was determined not to suffer that fate. Around 3:30 p.m., Hitler and Eva Braun entered their private quarters. She took a cyanide capsule. He bit into a cyanide capsule and simultaneously shot himself in the head. Their bodies were carried up to the garden, doused with gasoline, and burned while Soviet shells landed nearby. The man who had promised to make Germany great had reduced it to ashes, and then reduced himself to ashes as well. But the war wasn't over. Hitler had appointed Admiral Dönitz as his successor. For 8 more days, German soldiers would continue dying for a cause that was already lost, for a leader who was already dead, for a regime that no longer existed. The final week of the war was chaos. On May 1st, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, murdered his 6 young children with cyanide. Then he and his wife committed suicide. The architect of the big lie ended his life with a final terrible act. On May 2nd, Berlin surrendered. Over 100,000 German soldiers became Soviet prisoners. The iconic photograph of Soviet soldiers raising the red flag over the Reichstag was staged for propaganda, but the symbolism was real. The Nazi capital had fallen. Across Germany, the pattern repeated. Units surrendered en masse. Officers who had sworn loyalty to Hitler suddenly discovered they valued their lives more than their oaths. German soldiers ripped off insignia and tried to blend in with civilians. The Wehrmacht, once the most feared military in the world, was dissolving like a nightmare in daylight. On May 4th, German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands surrendered to British Field Marshal Montgomery. On May 5th, Admiral Dönitz ordered all U-boats to cease operations and surface. On May 7th, 1945, at 2:41 a.m., in a red brick schoolhouse in Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces. The surrender would take effect at 11:01 p.m. on May 8th. The Soviets insisted on a second ceremony in Berlin for their own propaganda purposes. On May 8th, in the Soviet headquarters in Berlin, Field Marshal Keitel, who had enabled Hitler for years, signed the surrender again, as Soviet Marshal Zhukov looked on. At 1 minute past midnight on May 9, 1945, the shooting stopped. The war in Europe was over. The Germans called it Stunde Null, 0 hour. The moment when everything ended and everything began. The numbers are staggering. 9 million. Germans homeless, 20% of all housing destroyed. Every major city damaged or destroyed, 4 or 5 million. German soldiers dead in the final year alone. Millions more in prisoner of war. Camps currency, worthless. Economy non-existent. Government ceased to function. Society shattered. Germany didn't just lose the war. Germany ceased to exist as a nation. It was divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the Allies. It would remain divided for 45 years. The Nuremberg trials would put Nazi leaders on trial for crimes against humanity. Executions followed. Denazification attempted to remove Nazi ideology from German society. But perhaps the greatest judgment came from the simple arithmetic of time. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years. 3 months and 8 days, from January 30th, 1933, to May 8th, 1945, the final collapse, from New Year's Day to surrender, took just 129 days. The story of Nazi Germany's final collapse teaches us something profound. Empires built on lies, conquest, and hatred contain the seeds of their own destruction. For a brief moment, Nazi Germany seemed unstoppable. It conquered most of Europe. It seemed to prove that might made right, that ruthlessness would prevail, that a superior people could dominate through force. But 129 days showed how quickly illusions collapse when confronted with reality. All the propaganda couldn't create fuel for tanks that didn't exist. All the fanaticism couldn't stop millions of Allied soldiers. All the wonder weapons couldn't undo the fundamental math of fighting the entire world at once. In the end, the 1,000-year Reich lasted about as long as a child's time in elementary school, and it ended not in glory, not in heroic last stands, but in a bunker with a suicide, in burning cities, in mass surrenders, in total defeat. 129 days. That's how long it took for everything to fall apart. Remember that the next time someone promises you a glorious empire that will last forever, history suggests you should count the days until it doesn't.